Excuse me? Did you just touch my groceries? The sharp voice cut through the low hum of the supermarket like a blade. Heads turned as Eleanor Kensington, draped in an expensive designer coat and holding a small handbag worth more than an average monthly paycheck, glared at the young grocery clerk in front of her. Jake Reynolds, a clean-cut man in his late 20s, stood frozen. His hands were midair, about to bag the organic produce she had placed on the conveyor belt. He had been working at Reynolds Market for years, but he had never encountered someone quite like her. "Ma'am, I was just bagging your items." "Don't touch them," Eleanor snapped, stepping back as if he had just tried to hand her a piece of garbage. "I don't need some lowly grocery boy smudging my things with his, whatever it is you people touch all day." A hush fell over the checkout area. Even the cashier, a college student named Jenna, swallowed nervously. Jake's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am." Eleanor let out a scoffing laugh. "Your job? Please, do you even belong here? You look like you should be begging for change, not handling my groceries." Gasps rippled through the nearby customers. Jenna bit her lip, and an elderly woman in line gave Eleanor a disappointed look. But Eleanor didn't care. She was used to people watching her, used to getting what she wanted, used to being untouchable. Jake's fingers curled into fists for a brief moment before he forced himself to relax. He had dealt with rude customers before, but this was personal. Little did Eleanor know, the store she was standing in, the very place she was humiliating him, was owned by his family. And soon she would learn the truth in the most humiliating way possible. Jake took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain professional. He had grown up watching his grandfather build this store from the ground up, turning it into a family legacy. But right now, none of that mattered, because Eleanor Kensington saw only a grocery clerk, someone she deemed beneath her. Eleanor flicked a perfectly manicured hand toward the cash register. "Just hurry up, I don't have all day." Jenna hesitated, her fingers hovering over the buttons. "Would you like paper or plastic, ma'am?" Eleanor rolled her eyes. "Does it look like I care? Just get it done." Jake watched in silence as Jenna quickly bagged the items. He could see the way the young cashier's hands trembled, intimidated by the rich woman's presence. Jake hated bullies, especially the entitled kind who thought money gave them the right to treat others like dirt. As Eleanor pulled out a black credit card and shoved it toward Jenna, she scoffed. "Honestly, I don't even know why I'm here. This place is so basic." She wrinkled her nose as she scanned the interior of the store. "I usually shop in Paris or Milan, but my personal chef is out of town, so here I am, forced to interact with this." She gestured vaguely toward Jake, Jenna, and the other employees. Jake's patience was running thin, but he knew that soon Eleanor was in for a rude awakening. Jenna swiped the card, but the register let out a loud beep. It says declined." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Impossible. Try again." Jenna did. The register beeped again. "It's still declined, ma'am." A couple of customers behind her snickered, and Jake couldn't help the small smirk that tugged at his lips. Eleanor's face turned red, a mix of embarrassment and anger. "Ridiculous. I have more money than all of you combined. This must be a mistake." She pulled out another card, throwing it on the counter. "Try this one." Jenna swiped it. Another beep. Declined. Now, all eyes were on Eleanor. Jake leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Ma'am, it looks like there's an issue with your card. Would you like to pay in cash?" Eleanor clenched her teeth. "I don't carry cash. What do I look like, a peasant?" Jake bit back a laugh. "Well, in that case, we may have a problem." The room was dead silent, waiting to see how this unfolded. Eleanor's face darkened. "Don't you know who I am?" Jake's smirk grew. "Oh, I do, Miss Kensington, but I don't think you know who I am." She frowned, clearly confused. "You're just some grocery store worker." Jake straightened, adjusting his employee badge. "Actually, I'm Jake Reynolds. My family owns this store." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "You're lying." Jake pulled out his phone, tapping the screen a few times before holding it up to her. A news article from a business magazine appeared, showcasing a photo of him next to his grandfather under the headline, "The Reynolds Family Legacy: How One Small Grocery Store Became a Multi-Million-Dollar Empire." Eleanor's hands trembled as she fumbled through her designer bag, pulling out yet another card. She shoved it toward Jenna with forced confidence. "This one will work." Jenna hesitated but swiped it anyway. Beep. Declined. The silence in the store was deafening. Customers were whispering, exchanging amused glances. A young man in a hoodie pulled out his phone, discreetly recording. The once flawless image of Eleanor Kensington, the wealthy, untouchable socialite, was crumbling right in front of them. Eleanor's breath came faster, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. "This is a mistake," she muttered, voice shaking. "I'll call my bank. I'll have them fix this." Jake leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable. "No rush, ma'am. We'll wait." Eleanor glared at him but pulled out her phone, stepping aside as she dialed. The moment she walked a few feet away, Jenna let out a breath. That was intense. Jake chuckled. "And it's only getting started." A few minutes later, Eleanor returned, her face pale. "It seems there's been a freeze on my accounts." Jake raised an eyebrow. "A freeze? That's unfortunate." She gritted her teeth. "Apparently there was some fraudulent activity. My bank is sorting it out." Jake exchanged a look with Jenna. They both knew what that meant. Eleanor was broke. But instead of rubbing it in, Jake saw an opportunity. He stepped around the counter, standing directly in front of her. "Miss Kensington, would you like some help?" Eleanor's nostrils flared. "Help? From you?" Jake nodded. "Yes, but not the kind you're thinking." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "I don't need your charity." Jake tilted his head. "Are you sure? Because from where I'm standing, you're about one step away from asking someone for spare change." The color drained further from Eleanor's face. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Jake shrugged. "Not particularly. But I do think there's a lesson to be learned here." Eleanor glared at him, but for the first time she didn't have a comeback. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the handle of her designer purse, her knuckles turning white. The idea of accepting help from a mere grocery store clerk, someone she had insulted just minutes ago, was unbearable. But she could feel the eyes of the customers on her, the weight of their silent judgment pressing down like a heavy storm cloud. "I don't need your help," she spat, straightening her posture in a feeble attempt to reclaim her dignity. Jake simply smirked. "Suit yourself." He turned to Jenna. "Go ahead and void the transaction. We'll put these back." Jenna nodded and began clearing the register, moving Eleanor's expensive groceries off to the side. Eleanor's stomach twisted. "No, this isn't happening. Not to me." "Wait," she blurted out, her voice softer now. "Just let me take the essentials. I'll pay you back." Jake folded his arms across his chest. "That's not how it works, Miss Kensington." Her lips parted in shock. "You're really going to let me starve?" "No, I'm going to let you experience what it feels like to struggle," Jake said coolly. "You think people choose to be in this position? That they deserve to be talked down to?" Eleanor swallowed hard. This was a nightmare. Then, Jake reached into his back pocket and pulled out a crisp golden business card. He held it up between two fingers, and for the first time Eleanor saw a name that made her blood run cold. Jacob Carter, co-owner, Carter Family Markets. She stared at it, mouth slightly open. "Carter Family Markets," she whispered, realization dawning. Jake gave her a knowing smile. "That's right, my family owns this store. In fact, we own over 100 across the state. And you've been throwing a tantrum in one of my stores." A sick feeling curled in Eleanor's stomach. Jenna grinned, leaning in slightly. "Looks like the tables have turned, huh?" Eleanor's breath hitched. She stared at the golden business card as if it might burst into flames in her hand. This can't be happening. The customers around her whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others exchanging amused glances. The very people she had looked down on were now watching her at her lowest. Her lips parted, but no words came out. What could she even say? Apologize? Beg? This was supposed to be her world, not his. Jake's expression was unreadable, but there was no denying the quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "I've dealt with people like you my whole life, Miss Kensington," he said, tucking his hands into his pockets. "Entitled, cruel, acting like the world revolves around them. But the funny thing about life, it has a way of humbling people." Eleanor's fingers curled into fists. "I didn't know who you were." "Does it matter?" Jake countered, raising an eyebrow. "Should someone's worth be based on their title, their wealth? Because if so," he tilted his head, eyes locking onto hers, "where does that leave you now?" Eleanor flinched. The words stung more than she wanted to admit. Jenna smirked from behind the register. Karma sure is quick today. Eleanor inhaled sharply, her face burning with humiliation. She could feel the weight of her past actions crashing down on her. The way she had belittled staff, thrown insults at anyone beneath her, acted as though money would always protect her. And now, standing in front of Jacob Carter, she had none of that. For the first time in years, she felt small. Jake glanced at Jenna. Pack up her groceries, the essentials. Eleanor's eyes widened. You're giving them to me? Call it an act of kindness, Jake said with a shrug. Or maybe I just want to see if you can handle being on the receiving end of generosity for once. Eleanor swallowed hard. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to keep whatever sliver of dignity she had left. But the hunger clawing at her stomach made the choice for her. Thank you, she murmured, barely audible. Jake smiled. We all need help sometimes, Miss Kensington, even you. Eleanor clutched the grocery bag, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. Not because of the contents, but because of what it symbolized. Humility, dependence, a stark contrast to the life she once had. She glanced at Jake, half expecting him to gloat, to revel in her downfall. Instead, he simply studied her, his gaze calm but firm. It was almost worse than outright mockery. Take care, Miss Kensington, he said, turning away as if the encounter was already forgotten. Eleanor's lips parted, but she couldn't find the right words. What was she supposed to say? That she wasn't always like this? That she used to be someone? That she never meant for things to turn out this way? But she wasn't sure if any of that was true anymore. As she stepped outside the store, the cold wind hit her like a slap. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to shield her from the chill. People bustled around her, completely unaware of the war raging inside her. She used to be the kind of woman who didn't have to carry her own groceries, the kind who would snap her fingers and assistants would rush to her aid. Now, she was just another struggling face in the crowd. Her stomach twisted at the memory of the life she'd taken for granted. The endless champagne brunches, the designer shopping sprees, the luxurious vacations, all gone. She walked aimlessly down the street, her heels clicking against the pavement. Every step felt heavier than the last. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Kensington had no idea where she was going. Eleanor wandered through the city, her mind clouded with memories of her old life and the harsh reality she now faced. She felt as if the world had flipped upside down. And she was no longer the woman she once was. Her expensive heels, now scuffed from walking longer than she ever had before, clicked against the pavement. She tightened her coat around her, the cold biting through its once luxurious fabric. She used to scoff at the idea of struggle. She had lived in a world where people like Jake didn't matter, where she could crush anyone beneath her expensive stilettos with a simple, condescending glance. But now, she was the one being ignored. As she turned the corner, she caught her reflection in a store window. The woman staring back at her was unrecognizable. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled from the wind, and the once confident spark in her eyes had dulled. She thought of the way she had treated Jake, how she had humiliated him without a second thought. She had assumed he was just another struggling worker, someone beneath her. But in the end, the joke had been on her. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Was this karma? Fate? Or simply the universe teaching her a long overdue lesson? She lowered her gaze, her hands tightening around the grocery bag. She had never felt so small. Taking a deep breath, she turned back toward her apartment, a tiny, one-bedroom space that could barely fit the memories of her past life. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was clear. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that grocery store earlier that day. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. Eleanor shuffled through the narrow hallway of her tiny apartment, the dim light flickering overhead. She placed the grocery bag on the small kitchen counter and stared at it. It was the first time in years she had bought food with her own money. No assistance, no extravagant deliveries, no premium organic selections. Just simple, budget-friendly necessities. She let out a shaky breath. Her phone vibrated on the counter, pulling her out of her thoughts. A message from an old socialite friend popped up. Eleanor, darling, where have you been? The gala at the Grand Estate is tomorrow. Surely you wouldn't miss it? Tell me you're still coming. Eleanor clenched her jaw. The old her would have eagerly responded, confirming her attendance with some grand entrance in a designer gown. But now, she had nothing. No status, no wealth. A part of her wanted to pretend, to show up and fake her way through the night. But what would be the point? Those people weren't her friends. They would whisper behind her back the moment they discovered the truth. She shut off her phone and sighed, rubbing her temples. Then, as if fate had perfect timing, a knock echoed through her tiny apartment. Frowning, she walked to the door and opened it. Jake stood there. Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. He wasn't in his grocery store uniform this time. Instead, he wore a sharp suit, nothing flashy but well-tailored. He looked every bit the successful businessman she had completely overlooked before. "Jake?" she breathed, barely able to process why he was here. His expression was unreadable. "Mind if I come in?" Eleanor hesitated. The shame of their last encounter flooded back into her. What did he want? To gloat? To throw her humiliation back in her face? Despite her pride, she stepped aside and let him in. Jake glanced around the modest apartment before turning to her. "I heard what happened. About your father's company. About everything." Eleanor swallowed hard. She wasn't sure how much he knew, but it was obvious he had been paying attention. She folded her arms, trying to keep a sense of control. "Did you come here to mock me?" Jake shook his head. "No, I came here because I know what it's like to lose everything." Eleanor scoffed. You own that store. You're doing fine." He leaned against the counter, his expression calm. "I wasn't always fine. My family had money once, just like yours. My father was a businessman too. But bad investments, betrayal, everything crumbled. I was a teenager when I watched my parents lose everything. We had to start from scratch." Eleanor blinked, caught off guard. He continued, his voice steady. "That grocery store? It's not just a business. It's something we built from nothing. My parents worked hard, and I took over to honor them. That's why I didn't lose my temper when you insulted me back there. I knew where you were coming from. I was you, once." Eleanor's throat tightened. Jake studied her for a moment before speaking again. "I also know that when you're at your lowest, you have two choices. Stay bitter, or grow from it." His words hit her like a hammer. For so long she had been angry at her father for leaving her nothing, angry at the world for turning its back on her, angry at herself for not seeing it all coming. And here Jake was, someone she had dismissed so easily, offering her wisdom instead of revenge. She dropped her gaze. "I don't know how to start over," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake smiled faintly. "Then let me help you." Eleanor looked up, startled. Jake extended his hand. "You're not the first person to fall, Eleanor, and you won't be the last. But I can tell you this, you're stronger than you think." Her lips parted slightly, her mind racing. For the first time in months, she felt something other than shame. She felt hope. Eleanor stared at Jake's outstretched hand. It was a lifeline, one she never expected. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, hesitating just before their hands met. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't hesitate. "Because I know what it's like to feel lost, and because I believe in second chances." Eleanor let out a shaky breath and finally took his hand. At that moment, something shifted. For the first time in months, she wasn't just a fallen socialite. She was a person, one with a future. The next morning, Eleanor found herself standing in front of Jake's market. The sight of it brought back a flood of memories. Her arrogance, her cruel words, the way she had dismissed Jake as nothing more than a grocery clerk. Now, she was about to step inside as someone completely different. She took a deep breath and walked in. Jake was already there, standing by the counter, chatting with an older woman who was sorting produce. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. "Right on time," he said, nodding in approval. Eleanor managed a small smile, nerves twisting in her stomach. "So, where do we start?" Jake gestured to a stack of produce crates. "You'll help with inventory today. It's nothing glamorous, but it's important." Eleanor nodded. She had never lifted a crate in her life, but she was determined not to complain. As she got to work, she realized just how much she had taken for granted. Every apple, every can, every stocked shelf had a purpose. Every worker had a role. It wasn't just a grocery store. It was a well-run operation that kept people fed, provided jobs, and supported the community. For the first time, she saw the business side of things, and it fascinated her. By the end of the day, she was exhausted, but she had never felt more accomplished. Jake leaned against the counter, watching her with an amused expression. "Not bad for your first day." Eleanor wiped her forehead, smiling despite herself. "I didn't think I'd survive." Jake chuckled. "You did more than survive. You learned." Eleanor's smile faded slightly. "I was awful to you, Jake. I don't know if I'll ever make up for that." Jake shrugged. "You already are." Eleanor looked around the store, taking in the sight of something she had once mocked. Now it felt like the beginning of something new. A second chance. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor dedicated herself to learning every aspect of Jake's market. She arrived early, stocked shelves, helped customers, and even worked the register. At first, people whispered about her, the once arrogant socialite now wearing an apron and scanning groceries. But as time passed, they saw her determination, and the whispers turned into admiration. One afternoon, as Eleanor was helping an elderly customer carry groceries to her car, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Well, well, well, look at you." She turned around, her stomach twisting as she faced Vanessa. Vanessa looked as polished as ever, dressed in designer clothes and holding a luxury handbag. But her expression was full of mockery. "I almost didn't recognize you," Vanessa continued. "Trading in your penthouse for a grocery store? That's tragic." Eleanor swallowed hard, feeling the old sting of humiliation creeping in. But then she glanced at Jake, who was watching from inside the store, and something inside her shifted. She wasn't the same woman Vanessa had known. Lifting her chin, Eleanor smiled. "It's not tragic. It's a fresh start." Vanessa laughed. "A fresh start? Please. You were born for luxury, Eleanor. You don't belong here." Eleanor took a deep breath, gripping the grocery bag in her hand. "I used to think that too, but I was wrong." Vanessa's smirk faltered for a brief moment before she scoffed. "Suit yourself. Just don't expect me to come shopping here." With that, she turned on her heel and strutted away. Eleanor let out a shaky breath and turned back toward the store. Jake was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, an approving smirk on his face. "You handled that well," he said. Eleanor exhaled, a weight lifting off her shoulders. "Yeah, I think I did." For the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor grew more confident in her new life. She was no longer the woman who strutted through grocery aisles looking down on others. She had become part of the store's heartbeat. Jake noticed it too. She wasn't just helping out anymore. She was taking ownership of her work. She implemented small changes that improved efficiency, treated every customer with warmth, and even inspired the staff with her resilience. But just as she started to feel at peace, another storm rolled in. One evening, as Eleanor was balancing the books in the back office, Jake entered with a grim look. "We've got a problem," he said, handing her a letter. Eleanor took it and skimmed the contents. As she read, her blood ran cold. It was a formal offer to buy Jake's market from none other than Vanessa Harrington. "She's planning to build a high-end retail space in this neighborhood," Jake said. "If she buys us out, the market will be gone." Eleanor clenched the paper, her hands shaking. Vanessa wasn't just mocking her anymore. She was trying to erase everything she had worked for. "We can't let this happen," she whispered. Jake sighed. "The offer is big. I won't lie, Eleanor. We're struggling. If I refuse, she might pressure the landlord to sell the property out from under us." Eleanor's mind raced. She had already lost everything once. She wasn't about to let Vanessa take this away from her too. She met Jake's gaze, determination burning in her eyes. "Then we fight." Eleanor knew that fighting Vanessa wouldn't be easy. Vanessa had money, influence, and the arrogance to believe she was untouchable. But Eleanor had something Vanessa lacked: experience at rock bottom. She had learned to survive, adapt, and rebuild. And she wasn't about to let the store that had given her a second chance be destroyed. Jake sighed, rubbing his temples. "We can't match her offer, Eleanor. Even if I wanted to fight back, I don't have the resources." "Then we find another way," she said firmly. "We don't need to match her offer. We just need to prove that selling to her is a mistake." Jake frowned. "How do we do that?" Eleanor grabbed a notepad and started scribbling. "We make the store indispensable to the community. If we show the landlord that Jake's market is worth more than just a check from Vanessa, he won't sell." Jake leaned in. Go on. We organize a neighborhood event, she said. A community fundraiser, a farmer's market day. Something that shows how much people rely on this place. We bring in news coverage, social media buzz. We make the landlord see that selling this market isn't just about money. It's about the people. Jake considered it, nodding slowly. That could work. Eleanor smiled for the first time in days. It will work, but we need to move fast. With a new sense of purpose, they put the plan in motion. Eleanor wasted no time. She spent the next morning calling local businesses, speaking to vendors, and organizing volunteers. Word spread quickly. Jake's market was in danger, and the people who had relied on it for years weren't about to let it go without a fight. She stood in the middle of the store, clipboard in hand, directing people. Okay, we need signs, flyers, and social media posts. We need to let everyone know that this is our market, and we won't let some outsider take it away. Mrs. Carter, an elderly woman who had shopped at Jake's for decades, patted Eleanor's arm. You tell me what to do, dear. I'll call the local paper, and I know a reporter who loves a good David versus Goliath story. Eleanor grinned. Perfect. Meanwhile, Jake worked the phone lines, talking to suppliers and farmers, convincing them to donate goods for the big event. He had never seen his store so full of life, people working together with a common goal. The community was fired up. The day of the event arrived, and Jake's market had never looked more alive. Banners hung from the storefront, tables were set up with fresh produce, and local musicians played in the background. The parking lot was packed with families, longtime customers, and even local business owners who wanted to show their support. Eleanor stood near the entrance, watching as people flooded in. This has to work, she thought. Jake walked up beside her, wiping his hands on his apron. We've got news cameras setting up over there, he said, nodding toward a small media crew, and a city council member just showed up. I think we've got their attention. Eleanor smiled. Now we just need to make sure the landlord sees it. Vanessa arrives. As if on cue, a sleek black car pulled up. Vanessa stepped out, dressed impeccably in a designer outfit that screamed wealth and entitlement. She took one look at the scene and scoffed. This is cute, she said, approaching Jake and Eleanor. But it won't change anything. I have the money, and your landlord is a businessman. He'll take my offer. Eleanor crossed her arms. Are you sure about that? Vanessa smirked. Oh, sweetheart, I always get what I want. Just then, Mr. Reynolds, the landlord, arrived. He looked around at the crowd, taking in the energy, the loyalty, the undeniable love people had for Jake's market. His expression softened. Jake stepped forward. Mr. Reynolds, before you make any decisions, I just want you to see what this market means to people. The older man nodded. I can see that. Vanessa flipped her hair. But business is business. My offer stands. Mr. Reynolds turned to her, then back at the store. The event, the people, the overwhelming support, it was clear what the right decision was. I'm not selling to you, Vanessa, he said firmly. Vanessa's jaw dropped. What? Eleanor smirked. Vanessa clenched her fists, her face turning red with frustration. This is ridiculous. You're turning down a once-in-a-lifetime deal because of what? Some sentimental nonsense? Mr. Reynolds adjusted his tie and looked at her with a calm yet firm expression. It's not nonsense, Vanessa. This store has been a part of this community for decades. Selling to you would mean tearing apart something that actually matters to people. Money isn't everything. Vanessa scoffed, her voice rising. This is business, Mr. Reynolds. You're making a mistake. No, I'm making a choice, he countered. Eleanor couldn't help but grin. The crowd, overhearing the conversation, burst into cheers and applause. Jake's market was safe. Vanessa, realizing she had lost, turned sharply on her heels and stormed toward her car. But before she could leave, a reporter stepped in her path. Miss Hudson, how do you feel about your offer being rejected? The reporter asked, microphone in hand. Vanessa forced a tight-lipped smile, masking her rage. No comment. But before she could escape, a customer shouted, Guess you're not the boss of everything, huh? The crowd laughed, and Vanessa sped off in her car, her humiliation complete. With Vanessa gone, the event turned into a full-blown celebration. Customers hugged Jake and Eleanor, congratulating them on saving the store. The band played upbeat music, and the smell of fresh-baked goods filled the air. Eleanor turned to Jake. Well, we did it. Jake, overwhelmed, ran a hand through his graying hair. No, you did it, Eleanor. I can't believe how much you fought for this place. She shrugged with a smile. It's more than a store, Jake. It's a second home. Mr. A. Reynolds stepped up beside them. I'll be honest, I considered Vanessa's offer, but after seeing all of this, there was no way I could let this market go. Jake shook his hand. Thank you, sir. You won't regret it. Eleanor turned to the customers. All right, everyone, let's show them why Jake's market isn't going anywhere. The crowd erupted into cheers, and the event carried on late into the evening, filled with laughter, music, and the unwavering spirit of a community that refused to back down. A few weeks later, news broke that Vanessa Hudson had suffered a major financial setback. One of her high-profile investments had collapsed, and she was facing serious losses. Meanwhile, Jake's market thrived more than ever. The media coverage from the event had drawn even more customers, and business was booming. One afternoon, Eleanor walked past the checkout counter and spotted an old woman smiling at her. You remind me of someone I knew, the woman said. A fighter. Eleanor grinned. Well, sometimes life gives you a battle, and when it does, she glanced around the store at the people, at the place she had fought to save. You fight to win.